I trusted him with everything: my home, my future, my heart. And then one day, with nothing more than a forged signature, he took it all away. The betrayal cut so deep, it didn't just shatter trust, it shattered blood itself. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I have lived in Charleston nearly my entire life, and yet every morning when I step onto the wide front porch of my house on South of Broad, I still pause to breathe in the salt air and listen to the tide lap against the seawall. That house has been my anchor, my pride, and in many ways, the last living piece of my wife, Ellen. She passed away 2 years ago, and ever since I have held on to the place like a man clings to driftwood in a storm. From the outside, it looks like an expensive waterfront property worth $9 million, but to me, it's more than a figure. It's 4 decades of birthdays, anniversaries, and the quiet, ordinary moments that made our marriage real. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I am 68 years old, and I have learned the kind of lessons you only gain through endurance. I am not a man of extravagance, though people assume so because of the house. I rise early, grind my own coffee, and sit with it on the porch as the sun edges over the river. Later in the day, I tinker with my wooden boat in the garage, sanding planks, sealing seams, enjoying the rhythm of small, purposeful labor. The days may appear uneventful, but to me, they are filled with meaning. My son, Brandon, does not see it that way. He is in his late 30s, ambitious, restless, never satisfied with stability. Over the years, I have supported him through his ventures. One failed real estate startup, another attempt at an app that never launched, and even the down payment for his first house. I never complained. That's what fathers do, they give. But lately, Brandon has begun to treat me like an obstacle rather than a parent. He insists I am too old to manage my own affairs, saying things like, "Dad, you shouldn't stress yourself with the paperwork. Let me handle it." His tone sounds caring on the surface, but beneath it lies something harder, sharper. Brandon's wife, Ashley, is a woman who knows how to read a balance sheet better than she can read a room. She is polished, clever, and always armed with market statistics. Whenever she visits, she talks about the Charleston property boom. "Thomas, waterfront properties are selling at record highs," she'll say with that clipped, professional smile. "You could cash out now, live comfortably in a modern condo, and still have millions left over." She makes it sound like a sound business move, but I know better. Selling would mean tearing myself away from the last real connection I have to Ellen. To Ashley, it's numbers. To me, it's a heartbeat. Inside the house are layers of memory. There's the small dent in the hardwood floor where Brandon dropped his toy fire truck as a boy. The sunroom is still painted in Ellen's favorite shade of pale yellow. Family photographs line the hallway, including one of our wedding day, her smile still radiant even as the colors fade. To anyone else, these details would be overlooked. For me, they are proof of a life well lived, proof that Ellen is still here in the quiet corners. That is why the thought of selling the house is unbearable. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the bank. The envelope was ordinary, but the language inside jolted me. A notice confirming financial power of attorney documentation. The words sat heavy in my lap. I stared at them, trying to recall if I had signed anything of the sort. Perhaps it was from years ago, during one of Brandon's failed ventures, when he had needed a co-signer, or maybe it was a clerical error. I folded the paper neatly and put it aside, convincing myself there was nothing to worry about. It was easier to dismiss it than to confront the uncomfortable suspicion blooming in my chest. Still, as the days passed, unease threaded its way into my routine. The house seemed quieter than usual, as though it too was waiting for something to happen. Every evening, when I closed the shutters, I couldn't shake the sense that Ellen's photograph on the mantel was watching me, urging me to pay attention. The truth is, I wanted to believe my son had my best interests at heart. I wanted to believe his wife's advice came from practicality rather than calculation. I told myself that Brandon's constant pushing, his offers to take over the paperwork, were nothing more than misplaced enthusiasm. I told myself Ashley was simply ambitious, not opportunistic. A man my age, widowed and vulnerable, clings to trust like a lifeline. But deep down, I knew the balance was shifting. My signature had become more valuable to them than my company. My house had become a prize rather than a home. And while I tried to quiet that voice of suspicion, it grew louder each day, whispering that the calm of my morning porch coffee was only the quiet before a storm I could not yet see. If you're still watching and the weight of that first betrayal hit you as hard as it did me, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. The morning began with something ordinary enough. Brandon had insisted on driving me to my cardiology appointment at the VA hospital. He said it was easier for him to get time off than for me to wrestle with the traffic and parking. I didn't argue. I've never liked the sterile smell of those clinics, the endless waiting rooms, or the way every nurse looks at you as if you're fragile glassware. Brandon's company was a welcome distraction, though I noticed he spent half the time on his phone, texting with quick, nervous fingers. When we pulled back into the driveway later that afternoon, my heart sank. Hanging from the iron gate was a sign that read, "Private showing, do not disturb." I froze. My house, Ellen's house, had been reduced to a property for display. I asked, "What in God's name is this?" Brandon laughed lightly, brushing it off. "Oh, Dad, don't worry. It's just an insurance thing. They sometimes bring inspectors by to reassess coverage." His explanation slid over me like oil on water, never soaking in. Still, I let it go, trying to believe that my son knew what he was talking about. But as we walked inside, the pit in my stomach grew heavier. Ashley was already waiting in the living room. Beside her stood a woman in a crisp blazer carrying a leather folder. Ashley's smile was perfectly rehearsed. "Thomas, this is Lisa, a mobile notary. We just need a quick signature for some insurance acknowledgments, nothing major." The notary handed me a document, pointing to a line near the bottom. The text was dense, filled with legal language I didn't bother to untangle. My eyes were tired, and I trusted that if my son and daughter-in-law said it was routine, then it must be routine. I signed, more out of politeness than conviction. Ashley leaned over the paper, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she examined my signature. It was a fleeting gesture, but one that left me uneasy. Why did it feel as though she were studying my handwriting, as if it were gold dust? That evening, while trying to check my online bank statements, I found myself locked out of my account. My alerts for deposits and withdrawals had vanished. Brandon noticed my frustration and quickly explained, "Dad, I updated your account security settings. Too many phishing scams these days. I'll manage the alerts for you, safer this way." I nodded reluctantly, though the words "safer this way" echoed like a riddle I couldn't solve. My financial world had always been mine, a sphere I controlled even when I knew little about markets. Now I was locked out, dependent on my son to tell me what was happening with my own money. Later that week, while walking back from the market, Ellen's old friend Ruth stopped me on the sidewalk. She had been one of Ellen's bridge partners and still called me Tommy, the name only Ellen used. "Tommy, are you finally selling that place? I've seen brokers coming and going, looked like contractors too. Thought maybe you were remodeling." Her words pierced through me like a nail. I forced a smile, telling her it must have been some mistake, but inside I felt the quiet panic of a man who realizes the ground beneath him is shifting. That night, restless, I went to the safe where I keep important documents. I pulled out the folder with our marriage certificate, the deed, Ellen's life insurance papers. As I shuffled through the stack, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A plain envelope, yellowed around the edges, addressed in Ellen's handwriting. On the front were 5 words that stopped me cold. "Open only when truly needed." I sat there with the envelope in my hands, the weight of it heavier than stone. My thumb traced the familiar curve of Ellen's script. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, to know what she had left behind. But another part clung to the fragile hope that maybe Brandon was right. that maybe Ashley was only being helpful, that maybe my fears were nothing more than shadows thrown by grief. I put the envelope back, closed the safe, and locked it. The house seemed to creak as if it disapproved of my hesitation. When I lay in bed, the breeze from the river came through the shutters, thick and heavy. The house felt altered, its silence deeper, its shadows darker. I could almost hear Ellen's voice urging me to pay attention, to trust my instincts. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes blurred, knowing in my bones that something was already in motion, something that would change everything I thought was secure. If you're still watching and the tension is pulling you deeper into this journey, drop a number 2 in the comments so I know you're still right here. I knew something was wrong the moment I turned onto my street. Even before the house came into view, my chest tightened, with that strange instinct that grief sharpens, the sense that the world is about to tilt again. When the gates finally appeared, my worst fear materialized in bold letters, a fresh white sign with the word "sold" hammered into the ground. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. I stopped in the middle of the walkway, staring at it as if the word itself were a weapon. My house, Ellen's house, our house, was no longer mine, at least not in the eyes of the world. Inside, the violation was already underway. 2 men in hard hats were stretching tape measures across the dining room. A woman with a clipboard was listing fixtures. Boxes of supplies lined the hall, as though the home were an abandoned property, ready to be gutted. The air smelled like dust and paint thinner instead of Ellen's old rose candles. Brandon appeared from the kitchen, smiling nervously as though he had prepared lines for this very moment. "Dad, I need you to stay calm. I sold the house. $9 million. It's the best move for all of us." I stood frozen, unable to process his words. "You what?" Ashley entered behind him, composed, a stack of documents in her hand. She moved like she was conducting a business deal, not dismantling a man's life. "It's already finalized, Thomas. The market was at its peak, and Brandon secured a buyer. This way, you won't have to worry about maintenance, taxes, or the burden of being alone in such a big place." Her tone was infuriatingly calm, like she was reading from a script meant to pacify me. "I never agreed to this," I said, my voice rising. Brandon held up a folder and slid out a document with a large notary seal stamped at the bottom. "Dad, you signed this? Durable power of attorney. You gave me the right to act on your behalf. Remember the hospital procedure a few weeks ago? You signed it then." My eyes locked on the signature. It was mine, shaky, unsteady. I remembered the day, sedated for an endoscopy, pen pushed into my hand, pages shuffled beneath it. My son had taken advantage of me at my weakest. "You tricked me," I whispered. Brandon's jaw tightened. "I protected you. You couldn't keep this place up on your own. The money will give you security." Ashley stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "We've already transferred the funds to my family's office. They'll manage everything properly. You'll get a modern condo, smaller, easier, with staff to help. And here," she reached into her purse and pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills. She set them on the table, as if she were tipping a valet. "This is for temporary expenses until we set up your account." The insult burned worse than the betrayal. 40 years of sweat, of paying mortgages, of saving through storms and market crashes, reduced to 3 bills and a patronizing smile. I walked down the hallway in a daze, past the workers scribbling notes about square footage, until I reached the living room. There, on the mantel, was the framed wedding photo of Ellen and me. Her eyes, frozen in joy, stared back at me. My hands trembled as I lifted the frame, clutching it to my chest. One of the contractors muttered to another about gutting the outdated kitchen. The words stabbed me. That kitchen had hosted Thanksgiving dinners, late-night cocoa with Brandon when he was a boy, Ellen's laughter as she burned her first attempt at shrimp and grits. Outdated? It was sacred. Brandon's voice echoed from behind. "Dad, you have 3 days to move out. It's already agreed with the buyer." I turned to him slowly, gripping the photo frame like a shield. 3 days to erase 40 years? 3 days to throw away your mother's memory? "You're not protecting me, Brandon. You're selling me." For the first time, he looked away. Ashley, however, stood tall, her eyes sharp, already planning renovations in her mind. She had one, at least for the moment. I gathered the photo in a box of family albums from the closet. That was all I could carry in the haze. Contractors stepped aside as I passed, treating me like a ghost lingering too long in someone else's home. On the porch, the late afternoon sun painted the river gold, mocking me with its beauty. I sat on the steps, the frame heavy in my lap, and felt the crushing weight of betrayal. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or unease. My son had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The boy I had once carried on my shoulders, the man I had bailed out time after time, had chosen money over blood. I looked back at the sold sign one last time. It wasn't just the house that was gone, it was the illusion that I still mattered to him. If you're still watching, and every twist is leaving you breathless, type number 3 below so I know you haven't let go. The night after the house was declared sold, I sat on the porch steps with Ellen's photograph in my lap, staring into the dark water. Sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the old timbers sounded like a countdown clock ticking away the 3 days Brandon had given me. I felt small, hollow, and dangerously close to surrender. But then a memory stirred, Ellen's voice, calm and practical. "When you don't know where to start with someone you trust." The next morning, I drove across town to see Claire Donovan. She had been one of Ellen's dearest friends and was now a seasoned attorney with a reputation for being unflinching. Years ago, she had helped us battle a shady insurance company after a hurricane damaged our roof. If anyone could cut through this mess, it was her. Claire listened patiently as I explained what had happened. The sold sign, the contractors, the $300 Ashley handed me as if I were a beggar. When I showed her the power of attorney Brandon had waved in my face, she leaned forward, her expression tightening. "Thomas, this was notarized the same day you were under anesthesia for your procedure at the VA. You couldn't have been competent to sign anything." My hands trembled as I slid the paper back into its folder. "But it's my signature." She shook her head. "It's your signature taken under duress. Worse, the notary who stamped this has a history, 3 complaints on file for improper witnessing. If this goes before a judge, Brandon and Ashley are in serious trouble." For the first time in days, I felt something sharp break through the fog. Hope. Claire wasted no time. She drafted an emergency motion to the county court to halt any further transfer of the deed and filed a lis pendens, a legal notice that marks the property as under dispute. Without it, the buyer could have passed the house along to another shell company, burying my claim. Now the title would remain radioactive until the court heard my case. Claire also called the police to file a report for elder abuse and financial fraud. When the officer arrived to take my statement, I felt the humiliation of saying out loud that my own son had tricked me, but I pushed through the shame. If Ellen were here, she would tell me that silence was the greater betrayal. Ashley, meanwhile, had not been idle. Claire uncovered that she had already moved chunks of the $9 million into different brokerage accounts, even siphoning some into digital assets that shifted overnight across platforms. It was a financial maze designed to make recovery as difficult as possible. I realized then that this wasn't Brandon's plan alone. It had Ashley's fingerprints all over it. My son might have been the face of the betrayal, but she was its architect. That evening, I returned to the house. Contractors were still measuring, talking about ripping out walls, debating whether the garage could be converted into a wine cellar. I couldn't bear to stay inside. Instead, I went to the safe. My hands shook as I unlocked it, and there it was, the envelope Ellen had labeled, "Open only when truly needed." I had resisted before, clinging to faith in Brandon, but faith had cost me enough. I opened it slowly. Inside was a short letter written in Ellen's steady hand. "Tom, if you're reading this, it means what I feared has come true. Brandon's ambition might one day blind him. I went to Claire years ago and recorded a life estate agreement. Whatever happens, you cannot be forced out of this house while you live. It is your right, and no one can take it from you." Beneath the letter was the document itself, stamped and recorded, giving me the legal right to remain in the home until my death, regardless of ownership. My throat tightened. Ellen had seen the storm long before I did, and had already planted an anchor. When I showed Claire the document the next day, she actually smiled. This changes everything. The so-called buyer just purchased a property shackled by your life estate. No investor wants a $9 million asset with a 68-year-old man entitled to live in it, rent-free for the rest of his life. This deal is rotten, and they know it. I felt strength seep back into my bones. For the first time since the betrayal, I wasn't just reacting, I had leverage. That night, unable to stomach the thought of sleeping in rooms strangers had measured and discussed demolishing, I dragged an old blanket out to the garage and stretched out on the wooden boat I had been restoring. The smell of cedar shavings and salt water comforted me more than the violated walls of my home. Before closing my eyes, I typed a message to Brandon. Tomorrow, I want to talk as men. I waited for a reply, but none came. Just the blinking dots of a message half written, then silence. It was silence that told me all I needed to know. He was already too far gone. If you're still watching and you can feel the storm building with each revelation, comment number 4 to show you're still standing strong with me. I had promised myself I would not let this rot fester in whispers and evasions. If Brandon was going to take my life apart, he was going to do it to my face. The next evening, I told him and Ashley to meet me at the house, my house. I wanted them to look me in the eye, standing on the porch Ellen and I had built together, while they justified why they had stolen everything from me. The air was heavy when they arrived, a humid stillness that made the trees lean close as though eavesdropping. Neighbors had noticed the tension and lingered at their fences, pretending to tend gardens or walk dogs. Brandon climbed the steps first, shoulders squared with defiance, while Ashley stayed a step behind him, her expression cool and unreadable, like someone who had already drafted the closing papers. "You wanted to talk, Dad," Brandon began, his voice sharp. "So, let's talk. But you need to understand something. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it to protect you. You can't handle this house anymore. It's wasted on an old man." The words landed like stones. I steadied myself against the railing. Protect me? You call tricking me into signing under sedation protection? You call selling my home behind my back loyalty? You didn't protect me, Brandon. You betrayed me. Ashley stepped forward. "Thomas, listen. This house is a financial burden. Brandon made a responsible choice. You'll be set up in a modern condo with everything you need. Isn't that better than rattling around in this place alone?" I felt my hands tremble, not with weakness, but with anger that had been building for weeks. Slowly, I pulled a folded document from my jacket. "You want to talk about responsibility? Then let's talk about foresight." Ellen saw this coming. She knew her son's ambition might blind him. I held the paper high enough for them to see. "This is a life estate agreement. It gives me the right to live in this house until the day I die. No sale, no buyer, no slick legal trick can take that away." Brandon's face paled. Ashley's eyes narrowed, calculating. She reached for the paper, but I pulled it back. "You didn't just underestimate me," I said, my voice rising. "You underestimated her. Even in death, Ellen saw through your greed." Brandon's composure cracked. "She was manipulative, always siding with you, always trying to control everything. And now, even gone, she's still interfering." The insult burned deeper than the betrayal. "Don't you dare speak of your mother that way," I roared. For years I had held my temper with him, hoping patience could save what love couldn't. But in that moment, the dam broke. She gave everything for this family, and you spit on her memory the way you've spit on me. The front yard had gone quiet. Even the neighbors froze in place, their curiosity sharpened by the sound of a family tearing itself apart. Before Brandon could answer, the crunch of gravel announced a new arrival. A detective stepped onto the property, flashing a badge. "Thomas Gray?" he asked. "We need to speak regarding a report of a forged power of attorney." His gaze shifted toward Brandon and Ashley. "And you two will want to stay close." Brandon stiffened. "This is a private matter." "Not anymore," the detective replied evenly. "Forgery and elder abuse are criminal offenses." Ashley's mask slipped for just a moment. Her voice trembled as she tried to recover. "Detective, this is all a misunderstanding. Thomas is confused. We can work out a settlement, money, housing, whatever he wants, if he'll just drop this." I looked at her, at the desperation beneath her smooth veneer. "This isn't about money," I said quietly but firmly. "It's about dignity. It's about the legacy of a life I built with your mother, and neither of you will buy me off." The detective nodded, jotting something in his notebook. Brandon's jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack a tooth. He shoved his hands into his pockets and muttered, "You'll regret this, Dad. You'll regret humiliating your own family like this." Then he stormed down the steps, Ashley close behind, her heels striking the wood like a metronome of contempt. I stayed on the porch, gripping Ellen's letter in one hand and the life estate document in the other. My whole body was shaking, but not from fear, from resolve. The war was no longer hidden. It was open, and I was finally standing my ground. The neighbors pretended to disperse, but I could feel their eyes on me. For once, I didn't care. Let them see. Let the whole town see. Brandon might have thought he had stripped me of power, but Ellen had given me a weapon he never expected, and I had no intention of laying it down. The night after the confrontation, I sat in the garage workshop, the only place in the house that still felt untouched. The scent of sawdust and motor oil lingered like an anchor, reminding me that this had once been my domain, where Ellen would sit on the old stool sipping coffee, while I tinkered with fishing rods or repaired the outboard motor. Now it felt like a sanctuary and a battlefield at the same time. My hands still shook from Brandon's words, from the venom he'd spit about his mother, from the threat that I would regret humiliating the family. Those words replayed in my mind like a scratch on vinyl. Part of me wanted to believe this could still be mended, that a father and son could find their way back. But another part, the larger part, knew that something sacred had been broken beyond repair. Claire came the next morning, her face set in that practiced calm lawyers wear when delivering hard truths. She placed a thick folder on my workbench and opened it. "Thomas, you have two options. You can pursue full criminal charges, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The evidence is overwhelming, and it could send Brandon and Ashley to prison. Or you can negotiate a settlement. You'd get restitution, a return of the funds, and an end to this nightmare, but Brandon avoids prison time." Her voice softened. "But understand, if you choose the settlement route, you're compromising Ellen's protections. You'd be making peace with people who see you as a liability, not as a father." I stared at the pages, my chest heavy. Brandon in prison, that was not an image I could summon without pain. He was still my boy, the one who once clutched my hand walking to school, who asked me to teach him how to cast a fishing line. But now, he was also the man who forged my signature, who sold my home out from under me, who spat on Ellen's memory. That night, unable to sleep, I unfolded Ellen's letter again. Her handwriting was steady, her words chosen with care. "Promise me, Tom, you will never let anyone strip away your dignity, not even those you love. Protect what we built. Protect yourself." Her voice seemed to echo in the quiet garage, as if she were standing just behind me. The words cut through my indecision like a blade. She hadn't written that letter for sentiment. She had written it because she knew I would face this choice, and she wanted me to remember what truly mattered. The following day, Claire called with new information. Her tone was clipped, urgent. "Thomas, we've traced the buyer of your house. It's a shell corporation tied directly to Ashley's family's investment firm. The sale wasn't just a betrayal, it was orchestrated fraud. They never intended to give you security. They intended to funnel the property into their network and bleed the money dry." The revelation was a thunderclap. Brandon hadn't just stumbled into Ashley's scheme. He had willingly walked me into a trap designed by her family. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated, systemic, deliberate. I felt a strange calm settle over me then. The kind of calm that comes when you realize there's no middle ground left. The choice wasn't between prison or settlement. It was between dignity and surrender. Ellen had told me which road to take long before this moment. That evening, I walked through the house alone. The rooms were quiet, stripped of Ellen's laughter, but still echoing with memories. I ran my hand along the banister she polished every spring, touched the wall where we had measured Brandon's height as he grew, lingered by the window where she used to sit with her sketchbook. The house wasn't just wood and nails, it was the archive of our lives. In the kitchen, I stopped at the table where Ellen and I had once whispered late into the night about our dreams for Brandon, about giving him every opportunity. I whispered aloud for the first time, "I choose us, Ellen. I choose dignity over blood." The words carried weight. They weren't just for her memory, they were for me. They were my decisions spoken into the silence, solidifying the path forward. I knew then what had to be done. There would be no compromise, no settlement, no easy escape for Brandon or Ashley. They had crossed a line that could never be erased, and now the law would answer for me. When I finally lay down that night, it wasn't on the boat in the garage or on a couch in fear. It was in the master bedroom Ellen and I had shared for decades. For the first time in weeks, I slept without waking in dread. The choice had been made, and in making it, I had reclaimed myself. If you're still watching and the impossible choices make your heart race, type number 5 so I know you're still walking this path beside me. The first signs of justice came not with a bang, but with the flash of red and blue lights across Brandon's driveway. I stood at the end of the block, my hands buried deep in my jacket pockets, watching as 2 patrol cars and an unmarked sedan pulled up to his manicured suburban home. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, pretending to rake leaves or walk their dogs. But everyone was really there for the spectacle. When detectives carried out boxes of files and computers, I felt both vindicated and gutted. Brandon emerged in handcuffs, his face pale, his jaw clenched as though he could crush his way out of reality. Ashley followed behind. Not cuffed yet, but clearly under subpoena. She kept her chin high, as if she still believed this was a misunderstanding money and charm could fix. The cameras were already there. Local reporters hungry for the headline, investment heir and husband accused of elder fraud. I didn't linger long. It wasn't triumph I felt. Watching my son being shoved into the back of a squad car carved into me deeper than I expected. That was my boy, the one I'd taught to ride a bike, the one Ellen had once swaddled against her chest during thunderstorms. Now, his name would be forever tied to betrayal, fraud, and greed. The community's reaction was swift. For years, I had been invisible, a quiet widower people passed at church or nodded to at the hardware store. Suddenly, I was the center of whispered sympathy. Mrs. Ruth from next door brought me a casserole, her eyes full of shame. "I'm so sorry, Thomas," she murmured. "We thought Brandon was just looking out for you." Others approached me in the grocery store, apologizing for ever doubting me, offering rides, help, or simply a pat on the shoulder. It should have comforted me, but instead it felt like salt in a wound. Their pity reminded me that this was not just a legal case. It was my family unraveling in public view. Ashley, never one to surrender quietly, launched her counterattack through her lawyers. They filed motions painting me as senile, confused, and unfit to manage money. They pulled my minor medical records into the spotlight: cholesterol medication, a few memory lapses noted during routine checkups, and twisted them into evidence that I was too fragile to know what I had signed. The words cognitive decline appeared in bold print on the legal brief, as though my entire identity could be reduced to a clinical assumption. Reading those documents shook me. For a night, I sat at my kitchen table with Ellen's photo beside me, wondering if maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe they could convince a jury I was just a senile old man clinging to a house he couldn't manage. But then I looked again at Ellen's letter, at the steady pen strokes where she had written, "Protect what we built. Protect yourself." The fog lifted. They weren't describing me. They were describing the version of me they needed to invent so they could win. And then came the twist none of us expected. Claire called one afternoon, her voice sharp with both triumph and alarm. "Thomas, investigators uncovered a trail. Ashley's family firm has been running this scam for years. Multiple properties, multiple seniors. Your house wasn't just a one-time betrayal. It was part of a larger laundering scheme." The revelation left me dizzy. All those times Ashley spoke about protecting family legacy, she hadn't been lying in her mind. She had been grooming Brandon to fold me into a family business of fraud, and my son had agreed. He hadn't just betrayed me out of weakness. He had conspired knowingly, willingly. That night, I sat alone in the study. Ellen's photograph glowed faintly in the lamplight. The storm outside rattled the windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside me. Justice was advancing, but at the cost of my son's freedom, his reputation, and whatever faint thread of father-son bond we once had. The paradox was unbearable. I was winning and losing at the same time. I picked up the photograph, brushed my thumb across Ellen's smile, and whispered, "The storm's here, Ellen. But I'll weather it." For us, the words steadied me. Justice was not a choice anymore. It was a duty to her memory, to my dignity, to the life we built. Claire's office became something like a war room in the days that followed. She gathered me, the lead detective, and a sharp-eyed financial investigator named Miller around a table stacked with files. Charts traced the flow of money through brokerage accounts, shell corporations, and offshore holdings that Ashley's family firm had used for years. Miller tapped the papers with his pen. This wasn't sloppy. It was deliberate, but we've managed to freeze enough assets to cripple them if we keep pushing. Claire leaned back, her gaze steady on me. "Thomas, we're at the point where we can unwind the fraudulent sale. With the life estate agreement and the forged power of attorney already in evidence, the buyer won't fight. But the bigger question is whether you want to stop here, recover your rights and move on, or pursue criminal prosecution against Brandon and Ashley." I rubbed my temples. If I go forward, Brandon could go to prison. He's still my son. The words felt heavy, scraping out of my throat like gravel. Claire's voice softened, but her conviction never wavered. Justice isn't revenge. You know that. This is about protecting others. If they could do this to you, they'll do it again. To someone else's father, someone else's mother. That's the choice you're facing. Her words stayed with me long after I left the office. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at Ellen's letter. I thought of the boy Brandon had been, the child who begged for bedtime stories, who asked me once if the stars were holes poked in heaven so angels could watch over us. And then I thought of the man he'd become, calculating, cold, willing to erase me for a paycheck. The ache in my chest was unbearable, but I knew Claire was right. This wasn't just about me. The next morning, the news ran a feature on elder financial abuse. My case was the headline. The reporter's voice narrated images of my house, the sold sign still lingering in front, and the footage of Brandon being escorted in handcuffs. My name scrolled across the screen, not as a victim, but as a symbol. Letters and emails began to arrive. Strangers telling me their own stories, children thanking me for standing up, seniors promising they felt less alone because of what I was doing. Their words gave me strength, but they also stripped me bare. My private grief was now public property. Miller called with an update later that week. "We've got leverage. Ashley's family falsified tax records tied to their investment firm. If we press, they'll have to cooperate with prosecutors. It could bring the entire operation down." His tone was professional, but beneath it, I sensed the thrill of a man who knew he had found a loose thread that could unravel a tapestry of corruption. That night, unable to sleep, I walked through the house. Each room hummed with Ellen's presence, the faint echo of her laugh in the living room, the scent of her lavender sachets still clinging to the drawers, the way moonlight spilled across the bed where she once slept. I whispered into the empty air, "If I do this, Ellen, I'll be erasing him from my life forever. Am I strong enough for that?" The silence that followed felt like her answer. She had always told me that love without boundaries becomes servitude, and servitude was not the legacy she wanted for me. The following morning, Claire accompanied me to the prosecutor's office. The affidavit was waiting, thick with legal language, but its meaning was simple. I was pressing charges. My hand shook as I held the pen, the weight of decades of fatherhood pressing down on me, but I did not hesitate. I signed. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper felt like a nail sealing a coffin, but also like a door opening to light. Outside, the courthouse steps gleamed under the afternoon sun. The flag above snapped in the wind. The fabric tugged in one direction, resolute against the pull. I stood there for a long time, watching it whip and billow, and whispered, "It's not just for me anymore. It's for every one of us who's been silenced." For the first time since Ellen's death, I felt taller. Not younger, not stronger, but steadier. The storm had taken my peace, my sun, and my illusions, but it had left me something unexpected, the certainty that I was still capable of choosing dignity, and that, I realized, was the beginning of real resolution. If you're still watching and the search for resolution has you holding your breath, drop number 6 in the comments so I know you're here until the end. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and varnished wood, a place designed for order but pulsing with tension. I sat near the front, hands folded in my lap, my back straighter than it had been in years. Across the aisle, Brandon and Ashley sat at the defense table. Brandon's suit hung loose on him, his face drawn and pale, while Ashley still tried to maintain that polished confidence, though her eyes betrayed flickers of panic. The prosecutor began with the foundation, the forged power of attorney. The notary was called first, a jittery man who admitted under oath that he had notarized my signature without verifying my condition. His testimony was damning, but the real blow came when the hospital records were introduced. They showed indisputably that at the exact hour of my consent, I had been sedated and incapable of signing anything knowingly. The jury murmured, and I caught the faint shake of Brandon's head, as if he still believed denial could change reality. When Brandon took the stand, my heart clenched. He looked younger somehow, not like the calculating man who had gutted my home, but like the boy who once begged me to let him steer the boat on the river. His lawyer prompted him to explain his actions. "I was protecting my father," Brandon said, voice firm but hollow. "The house was too much for him. I didn't want to see him suffer under the burden." The prosecutor rose slowly for cross-examination, her tone surgical. "If you were protecting him, why funnel the $9 million into accounts controlled by your wife's family? Why give him only $300? Why mislead him about the will and his rights?" Each question sliced deeper, and Brandon's answers grew tangled, defensive. The jury leaned forward, watching the contradictions unravel. The boy I remembered was nowhere to be found. Ashley's turn came next. She walked to the stand like it was a stage, her posture flawless, her voice clear. For a moment, she almost seemed convincing, speaking of family, of responsibility, of misunderstood intentions. But then the prosecutor presented the emails. Line after line revealed her instructions to associates about disguising property transfers, about pushing Brandon to get my signature, about using me as leverage. One email even read, "Once the old man is out, we'll fold it into the South Bay deal." The polished mask cracked. Ashley's voice faltered, her hands trembled. And when pressed about the laundering operation, she looked to her attorney for rescue. None came. The jury saw the truth as clearly as I had lived it. The final arguments were a blur. My eyes stayed on Ellen's folded letter in my pocket, my anchor in the storm. When the jury filed back into the room, the silence was thick enough to choke. The foreman rose, paper in hand. "On the count of elder fraud, we find Brandon Gray guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit financial crimes, guilty. On the count of fraud and financial misconduct tied to corporate entities, we find Ashley Monroe Gray guilty." The words fell like stones into a still pond, rippling through the courtroom. Ashley slumped forward, her composure gone. Brandon's jaw tightened, and for the briefest second, his eyes met mine. I searched for remorse, for recognition, but found only rage and disbelief. The judge's gavel struck. Sentencing was scheduled, but the weight of the verdict already pressed down like finality. Brandon faced years in prison. Ashley's sentence would be harsher still, tied to the laundering network. Relief washed over me, but it wasn't sweet. It was heavy, bittersweet, tinged with grief. I had won my house, my dignity, my truth, but I had lost my son. Justice had no joy in it, only clarity. As the bailiffs moved Brandon and Ashley away, reporters swarmed outside, microphones raised like weapons. Their voices shouted questions about betrayal, about justice, about what I planned to do next. I ignored them. Instead, I stepped into the sunlight and reached into my pocket. Ellen's letter was there, creased from weeks of being opened and refolded. I held it up briefly, then folded it again with care. "We won, Ellen," I whispered under the noise of cameras and questions. On our terms. The wind picked up, snapping the flag on the courthouse pole. I stood taller, not because the victory erased the pain, but because it honored her words. Protect what we built. Protect yourself. The verdict was not just mine, it was Ellen's, it was Justice's, and it was final. The weeks after the trial passed like a slow exhale. Brandon and Ashley remained in custody, awaiting sentencing. Their names smeared across newspapers and television reports. For the first time in months, the sold sign was gone from the yard. The house was mine again, not just on paper, but in spirit. When I walked through the rooms, I felt both the heaviness of memories and a new, quiet peace. Ellen's presence lingered, not as a ghost of grief, but as a steady reminder of endurance. Letters began arriving almost daily. Some were from strangers, men and women I had never met who had read about my case and wanted to share their own stories of betrayal. Others were from advocacy groups, thanking me for standing firm and shining a light on elder financial abuse. A senior center in town even asked me to speak at a gathering, to tell my story so others might find courage to protect themselves. I hesitated at first, but Claire reminded me that my fight had already reached far beyond my own home. "Thomas," she said gently, "sometimes survival becomes testimony." So I accepted. When I stood before that small crowd of gray-haired faces and anxious children, I didn't tell them about every detail of court proceedings or betrayal. I told them about Ellen's letter, about the power of dignity, about the need to protect what we build even from those closest to us. When I finished, people came forward with tears in their eyes, clutching my hands like I had handed them something precious. For the first time, I realized my pain had been transformed into a tool of defense for others. Back at the river house, I began to rebuild. Not just the walls, but my own life. I didn't want to erase Ellen's presence. I wanted to honor her. I had the garage cleaned out and rebuilt into a small workshop for neighborhood kids. On Saturdays, I taught them how to sand wood, how to hammer nails, how to carve something with their own hands. Watching their eyes light up as a plank of pine became a birdhouse or a toy boat reminded me that legacy wasn't just inheritance. It was teaching, guiding, leaving behind skills and dignity. On Ellen's birthday, I planted a tree by the riverbank. The soil was damp, the sky clear, and as I pressed dirt over the roots, I whispered a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for her foresight, for her voice in my darkest hours, and for the strength I'd found when betrayal had nearly drowned me. The tree stood slender and fragile in the earth, but I knew one day it would cast shade over the riverbank, just as Ellen's memory would always cast light over me. I began to see family in a new way. DNA no longer defined it. Family, I realized, was measured by respect, by love, by the refusal to exploit or diminish another's dignity. Sometimes protecting the legacy meant letting go of those who had chosen greed over blood. It was a bitter truth, but it was a truth I could live with. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the prison. The handwriting was unmistakably Brandon's. My hands shook as I opened it. The words were short, angry, and dripping with blame. He wrote that I had ruined his life, that I had chosen Ellen's memory over him, that I was no father. I folded the paper carefully and set it in a drawer without finishing. I would not let his bitterness take root in me. He had chosen his path, and I had chosen mine. As the sun dipped behind the trees one evening, I walked down to the riverbank. The water caught the light, throwing fire across the current. I stood there for a long time, Ellen's letter in my pocket, the new sapling at my side, and I whispered aloud, "The best revenge isn't destroying them. It's living the life they thought I'd never reclaim." Then I turned back toward the house, climbing the steps with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Inside, I placed Ellen's letter in the family Bible, its pages worn from decades of use. It was the resting place it deserved, a home for her words, a testament to survival. I closed the cover gently, like sealing a chapter, and breathed deep. The house, the river, the workshop, the tree, all of it was mine again. Not because of money or verdicts, but because I had chosen dignity over despair. And in that choice, I had found the only kind of victory that lasts. Life has a way of testing the very core of who we are, often in moments when we least expect it. Betrayal, especially when it comes from the hands of those closest to us, is a wound that cuts deeper than most. It is not only the loss of trust, but also the shattering of illusions we've held on to for years. Yet, within that pain lies a choice, whether to surrender to bitterness or to rise with a new understanding of dignity, strength, and self-worth. What becomes clear through trials like these is that legacy is not measured by wealth, property, or the approval of others. Legacy lives in the decisions made when one is pushed to the brink, in the refusal to let others define our worth, and in the courage to stand even when standing means standing alone. True strength is not found in the avoidance of suffering, but in the way one carries suffering with grace, allowing it to refine instead of destroy. There is an undeniable lesson in learning that family is not solely a matter of blood. It is a matter of respect, of honor, and of love that sustains rather than exploits. Sometimes the people we expect to protect us become the very ones who endanger our peace, and sometimes strangers or unexpected allies step in to remind us of our value. The bonds that matter most are forged in truth and loyalty, not convenience or gain. When betrayal arrives, it does not diminish the worth of the betrayed. It only reveals the true character of the betrayer. In these moments, one must hold fast to dignity because dignity cannot be stolen. Money can be taken, homes can be sold, reputations can be slandered, but dignity belongs only to the one who chooses to protect it. It becomes the anchor when everything else feels like it is drifting away, and often, it is the very thing that transforms pain into purpose. From the ashes of loss comes the possibility of rebirth. The collapse of old illusions makes space for new truths, new connections, and a new way of seeing the world. Even in the darkest betrayals, there is a gift hidden, the chance to rebuild a life not on the shaky foundations of dependence, but on the unshakable ground of self-respect. To endure and emerge whole is a triumph no one can erase. There is also a profound reminder that justice, while imperfect, has its place. Seeking accountability is not about vengeance. It is about protecting the vulnerable and honoring the sacrifices of those who came before us. By demanding truth, we do not merely fight for ourselves, but for everyone who might otherwise suffer in silence. To stand for dignity in the face of deceit is to declare that exploitation will not have the final word. As time moves forward, the scars of betrayal remain, but they need not define the future. They can serve as markers of transformation, symbols of survival, and proof of the quiet power within. To rebuild after devastation is to demonstrate that resilience is stronger than greed, that truth outlasts deception, and that even after the fiercest storms, the sky clears again. In the end, the greatest revenge is not in destruction or retaliation, but in living well, fully and authentically. It is in creating a life of meaning beyond the grasp of those who once tried to diminish it. To rise, to reclaim peace, and to live with purpose is to show that dignity, once chosen, is untouchable. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.